Hello, let's talk some hard sums that are in the news. And in particular, let's talk about acetaminophen and autism. So, pregnant mothers taking what's called Tylenol in the States, paracetamol in Britain and Europe, taking that during pregnancy, is it linked with higher outcomes for autism, ADHD, other neurological things? You'll know there's been a lot of fuss about this. Trump has sort of, trailed this announcement at the Charlie Kirk Memorial, and then on Monday he sort of had a session with RFK Jr. where they basically said, there's now research which says that taking Tylenol during pregnancy leads to higher rates of autism. And this is driven by a paper, and I'm just looking over my screen here so I can read it to you. It's driven by a paper called Evaluation of the Evidence on Acetaminophen Use and Neurodevelopmental Disorders Using the Navigation Guide Methodology. And that's by Prada, Ritz, Bauer and Baccarelli. You can Google that and I'll put a link below in both the YouTube and in the Substack. What the paper basically is, it's a navigation guide methodology, which is essentially a way of taking a whole bunch of papers and deciding whether they're valid or not and using them and coming to a conclusion based on that, sort of synthesizing the data. And they come out and they say, I'm going to read you directly the conclusion. Our analysis using the navigation guide thus supports evidence consistent with an association between acetaminophen exposure during pregnancy and increased incidence of NDDs, neurodevelopmental disorders. Appropriate and immediate steps should be taken to advise pregnant women to limit acetaminophen consumption to protect their offspring's neurodevelopment. Okay, they're wrong, or if they're right, as they admit within the paper themselves, they're only right potentially because of sample biases and things like that. So let me explain. They did a systemic search through papers discussing this. They looked at 27 studies. They had 46 studies, in total. 27 studies reported positive associations. So increased use of Tylenol, paracetamol led to increased incidences of autism and ADHD and things like that. 9 studies were null associations, so no statistical link, and 4 were actually negative associations. So essentially, the more paracetamol that you take, the less likely that your child is going to have autism. They claim higher quality studies were more likely to show positive associations. That's true, and we'll come and show that. But they then talk about risk of bias and strength of evidence ratings informing the overall synthesis. And this is the problem, okay? Because their data in this paper is quite high level and doesn't engage with the better papers that really go into detail as to why the correlations might occur and are there any other reasons for that, right? So in principle, as we'll see as we go through this, there is a observed correlation on the surface between higher use of paracetamol and a slightly higher incidence of neurological development disorders, as they call them. But that's a correlation. Doesn't mean that one causes the other. It could be that mothers who naturally have autistic babies are more likely to take paracetamol for various reasons. It could be that the samples are biased. So we're picking up samples that have more autistic children in them for various reasons, and that sample bias is associated with higher paracetamol, Tylenol usage. And there are ways to kind of get into that, and there's one study that we'll talk about at the end which does it beautifully and sort of picks that apart. So it's this paper that has driven this. And to be very clear, what they're saying is, if you take paracetamol as a mother, your child is slightly more likely to have autism or ADHD or some other neurodevelopmental disorder. They're not claiming at all that paracetamol causes this, right? That would be, in order to prove that, you would basically show that you had an extra 0% rate of autism children where the mother didn't take paracetamol, and almost all the autistic children were where the mum did take paracetamol. And that would be like paracetamol causes autism. I'm not saying that. They just claim there's a slightly higher incidence, and it's like sort of like you're 10% more likely to have a child with autism. So when Trump says, "Oh no, paracetamol's bad," he's kind of over-egging the case. But hey, that's Trump for you. Let's talk about another paper. Let's talk about acetaminophen in pregnancy and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, which is Damkier et al. In the Journal of Obstetrician and Gynecology. And this is another multi-study paper where you're looking at a whole bunch of studies. And they looked at 56 studies and whittled that down in terms of trying to remove the sample biases and the issues that we spoke about. We're going to kind of comment those in a bit more detail shortly. They whittled those down to about 9 studies which satisfied all their stuff. So an attempt to remove as much selection bias and as much sort of uncontrolling, come on to that, as possible. And what they actually found was that the more that you didn't control for what are called confounders, so things that might also be the causation, the more that you didn't control, the more likely a paper was to suggest that there was a link between paracetamol and autism and so on. So to read from their abstract, this suggests that residual confounding from shared genetic and environmental factors may have caused an upward bias in the original observations. Well, what that means in English is that actually things like genetic stuff and environmental factors that were causing autism, these papers that said paracetamol links with autism, they weren't really controlling for those. When you did start to control for those, it brings the correlation down. And they finally say the current level of evidence does not warrant changes to clinical guidelines on the treatment of fever or pain in pregnancy. Prospective research designed to account for familial and psychosocial environmental factors related to both maternal use of acetaminophen and children's neurodevelopment should be undertaken. So what they're basically saying is, given that some papers that do try to control for other factors have a much lower correlation rate than the papers that don't, we need to look into that, see what's going on there. And let's talk about a paper that does that. Okay, so now we are going to talk about, probably this is the best paper, in my opinion, in this subject. It's called Acetaminophen Use During Pregnancy and Children's Risk of Autism, ADHD and Intellectual Disability. It's by Ahlqvist et al., a bunch of a Swedish professor, researcher, and a bunch of his colleagues. And it is a sample of 2.5 million children born between 1995 and 2019, and a follow-up all the way through to the end of December 2021. So this is 2.5 million children, and what they've done is this is a large cohort study, not just looking at this issue but looking at lots of other issues. And they do things like they check the diagnosis in the children of all kinds of things, but they also ask the mothers to track various things through pregnancy and even while they're trying to conceive and stuff like that. And that helps them create big databases that they can link up and find statistical stuff. Right? So what they found was, in total, 185,909 children, that's 7.5% of their sample, were exposed to acetaminophen during pregnancy. Okay. Crude absolute risks at 10 years of age for those not exposed versus those exposed to acetaminophen were 1.33% versus 1.53% for autism. So what they're saying is, roughly, on just looking at this at the data in the top level, if your mother did take paracetamol or Tylenol during pregnancy, you had a 10% 10% greater chance of having autism, a diagnosis of autism by the time you got to age 10 than if your mother didn't. However, what they then did was run a series of further models, and what they tried to do was they tried to use siblings as a control. Now, the use of siblings and sometimes even twin studies, and again, twins can be monozygotic and non-monozygotic again, so we can sort of look at genetic and non-genetic factors. But siblings in general share a lot of genetics and tend to have the same environmental factors around them. So what you do is that if you compare, if you've got a mother who had one child that she did take paracetamol during that child's pregnancy and another that she didn't, and you can have a whole bunch of those, like tens of thousands of those, and stick them all together, then actually what you've got is a nice controlled sample there, right? What you're doing is you're basically saying the comparison is almost a like for like, in a way that actually you don't know when you look at the wider picture whether the children who did have autism, the parents who did take paracetamol, there was something different about them than the parents who didn't, or the children who are diagnosed with autism and those who aren't. There's something different about them. So is it like that? Is it as simple as the parents who are wealthier and get their children all more stroppy or something, but more likely to, there are reasons why they're more likely to have their child diagnosed as autistic. That's actually more linked to paracetamol use than paracetamol use causing autism. So it's things like that. So if you use siblings, you're basically trying to control for those kind of things. Now, when they control in this massive sample, right? So it's 2.5 million total, and obviously when you get down to siblings, there's not as many, but yeah, it's a lovely size sample. When they control for siblings like that, they find that there is no risk difference at all between mothers who take paracetamol and the likelihood of their child having autism, and mothers who don't take paracetamol and the likelihood of their child having autism. And it's a really robust result, right? The other thing that they find, which is, and they find this for ADHD, and they find it for other neurodiverse sort of things as well. And it's a fascinating result. The other thing that's amazing is they find that mothers who take aspirin in pregnancy, as opposed to those who don't, have much lower rates of neurodiversity in their children than those who didn't. So taking aspirin is actually really, really good if you want to prevent autism. Now that's crying out for another study. But essentially what I'm saying is this: when you look at it just sort of headline stuff, without trying to say, well, why? What are the other things that might be going on? The reasons why mothers who take paracetamol have slightly higher incidences of autistic kids. If you don't try to factor that out, to work out why that might be, you're left with that observation that mothers who take paracetamol are slightly more likely to have children with autism. But once you begin to try to factor in stuff, and you use the siblings to kind of check, if a mum has a sibling, has a child that she has taken paracetamol for, and another child which she hasn't, are the different incidence rates when you top them all up, throw them all into a big sample and top them all up? And the answer is no. And that indicates that it's something else going on in the data, in the environment. There's some other factor that is actually the link between that paracetamol taking and the slightly higher rate of autism. It's not the paracetamol itself that is causing it. The paracetamol taking, as it were, is correlated with something else that might be the cause of the higher rate of autism. And it could be as simple as a socio-economic factor, that paracetamol taking is more indicative of a higher propensity to have your child tested for autism and fix, and find out why, and understand your child kind of better. There's another paper, very briefly. It's a Japanese paper, Ukubo et al., Maternal Acetaminophen Use and Offspring's Neurodevelopmental Outcome, a nationwide birth cohort study. It's a smaller sample, it's a Japanese sample over a smaller time period. It's about 218,000 children that are involved. And it's a database from about 2005 to 2022, but it's the same results as the Swedish paper once you start doing proper controlling for stuff. Okay, so let's summarize that. 15 minutes of talking about numbers. I'll put links to the papers in the YouTube notes and in the Substack notes, but let's understand what's going on here. In summary, on a surface level, when you look at the raw stats, when mothers take paracetamol, Tylenol, acetaminophen, when they take paracetamol, they are slightly more likely to have children who are diagnosed with autism or ADHD or some other similar condition. However, once you control those samples, once you try to and sort of say, well, is there something else causing it, by using things like sibling analysis. Remember, sibling analysis would be to say, right, if I've got one child that does have autism diagnosis, one not, or I had one child that I did take paracetamol for and another that I didn't, that kind of thing. Assuming that the child's have roughly the same genetic background, which isn't perfect, but it's certainly, siblings have a better genetic link than just two random people, and they tend to have the same environmental factors that are going on around them. That said, everybody responds differently to the environment, but they're two kind of stabilizing factors. Once you take those things into account, there is no causal link between paracetamol and autism. You are as likely to have a child diagnosed with autism if you take paracetamol in pregnancy as if you don't. However, if you take aspirin in pregnancy, actually your chances are much reduced. Interesting. That should be researched. One final comment then. This for me is a bit of an example of how Trump tends to run away with one idea and follow it and not look at the full circumstances, the full sort of body of information. So he latches onto one thing and he goes with it. And honestly, it's pretty poor, really. The research is out there. It's very clear. I think some of the pushback against him has been a little bit too hard and has over-egged the case. There is a general observation, as we've said, in the wider population of slightly higher rates. And that has to be recognised. And some of the pushback has been like, this is, that doesn't even want to accept that. But it's one against one of these things where statistics brings out the subtlety. So, in summary, does acetaminophen, Tylenol, paracetamol taken by a mother in pregnancy increase the likelihood that the child will have autism, ADHD, some other similar condition? The answer is no. Do we need to better understand why, on the surface, it appears that mums who take paracetamol seem to have a slightly higher chance, but they don't when we control for environment and genetics and stuff like that? Do we need to understand that? Absolutely. Do we need to do much more research on the amazing observation that aspirin taking actually seems to be negatively, correlated? The more aspirin that you take, the less likely that your child is to have autism. That's fascinating. We need to go into there. Of course, in generally, paracetamol is advised over aspirin for various reasons that I won't go into. But I hope that's useful. Do at least read the abstracts, the abstracts on the papers that I linked to. Go into depth, I think, on the Swedish paper. It really is very, very interesting. And I hope you have a good day. Remember, as always with statistics, ignore the headlines, read the primary source. Read the data tables, read the regressions, find the odds ratios, understand what they are. That's where the actual meat is. Have a good day.